Welcome to this video on the Zen War channel. My name is Sri Satguru Buddha Rawa Bhagwan. As the channel name says, I am the Adi Shri Om Tek Rasiva, also known as Parasiva. In today's video on this channel, I will describe to you why it was explained to Arjuna that it was necessary sometimes to fight, even if those we fight are like family. Sometimes it is necessary to fight for what is right. This is also known as being a warrior of the Dharma. As there are, for example, akaras in India, lineage successions of warriors of the Dharma, warriors of God, protectors of their country and of their tradition. There are also in other countries spiritual practitioners, warriors who defend their countries, right? So basically, this goes beyond patriotism. This is a thing of protecting the culture of the land, right? Protecting the life of the land, protecting the land, protecting our ways, right? Having self-determination, not being a victim on our own land. So as in India, there are akaras, which are armies of God, in which spiritual practitioners develop their martial prowess. Now, one of the great secrets, of course, is that martial prowess is not always physical or mechanical or digital. It is also spiritual. And as the members of the akaras, for example, the Naga Babas, the Naga Sannyasis of India, or you also have those who have coincided with them, who have cohabited with them, also in the ash, the Agori. So you have different traditions and lineages of people who are warriors of God. And they also develop spiritually. And this is where they have their true strength. Although they often train, for example, martial arts or something like that, as well as part of the tradition. Physical exercises. But in this world, physical limitation. Usually what is practiced is spiritual practice in these akaras. And the spiritual practice develops the spiritual beings, the warriors, into forces of nature. And as such, these forces of nature, these divine forces, as they develop through lineage, that directly comes back to Shiva, the Adi Satguru. And they are there to protect the Dharma in India. They are there to protect their country, its people, its way of life, its traditions. They are defenders of the land, defenders of the Kshetram. And other countries have different spiritual traditions as well, right? Now, many of these spiritual traditions, some of them go to God directly for assistance, for help. Some of them go to intermediary other gods, deities, but not God himself, for help with things, for assistance. Some paths also have the development into a god. Right? Different paths. The path leading to the partial avatar. The path leading to the avatar. So you have different paths, and as in India, the Naga and the Agori have been side by side for so long now. Their paths, in their own ways, protecting the Dharma. And the Agori and the Naga become forces of nature, able to work with the forces of nature as well. And they can use these powers, these city powers they're called, to interact with the system and anything, anywhere. Using the city powers that they have been granted by the Lord of creation, the Adishri. So these akaras protect India and in the traditions and ways of India. And it is important for a country that is established and that lasts with a long culture, as Indian culture has lasted a long time. It is important for that country to establish a spiritual tradition, right? And whether that tradition be multiple traditions or one tradition or, accepting all traditions, there has to be a spiritual tradition. But my opinion is that it is also important for there to be the equivalent of the akaras in all countries. All countries should develop their own akaras to protect their countries and their traditions and their ways. So what does this mean is that all countries should develop divine beings to protect the country. Right? And it is the responsibility, in my opinion and in my tradition, that a spiritual being owes respect to the land in which they reside, and is responsible as a spiritual practitioner of different levels to protect their land, their home, whenever necessary, to protect their way of life. So when we talk about the Akaras in India, and we talk about, for example, the Nagas, and we talk about the Agoris, they develop special powers that they can use in their techniques that they develop. And when they practice and practice and practice, then they are granted grace from the Guru system. And then they get powers. And they become empowered warriors for the culture of their country. So they become also divine beings, right? Because they get divine powers, divine city powers. And there are different deities that can distribute city powers because they are authorized to sponsor for city powers. But the origin of all city powers comes from the Adi Shri, from the dish dispenser, Adish, a dish dispenser. The Adi Shri is the lord of the domain where the dishes come from, where they are dispensed, all within it and its walls. The Adi Shri are also integrated. The great Om Tek, Rasiva. So it is the responsibility of a spiritual practitioner to owe allegiance in a way to their land, because they are the spiritual practitioners, the spiritual leaders of that land. They are the establishment of the culture of that land and the protectors of the culture of that land. So as the Agoris and the Nagas are the spiritual masters in a way, in many ways, and there are other paths of India, while other countries also have their masters in a way as well. And it is the responsibility of a master, a spiritual master within a country, to have allegiance to their country. And when needed, when their country needs them, when their people need them, and the special powers that they developed through grace of the divine, through practice, through sadhana, through tapasya, but through grace. And this is how God helps the people of a country. When a country needs to be defended. So there are many ways to defend a country. By having the ultimate strength. By being self-sufficient. And in the future, with the No Attack Alliance, by creating and joining the No Attack Alliance of all people. And I've talked about this on this channel extensively. When all people ally themselves, where they will never expand again, but they will never lose their land again. And all the people alliance, all together, all say it, we will never expand again, except in places that are unoccupied. We will never attack anyone ever again, and we will all come to our defense if ever attacked. And we will all live in peace and prosperity. And all will be able to grow in their own way without anyone within the alliance telling them how to grow. Everyone's free to grow in their own way as long as they're trusted members of the alliance. And even if they weren't, then they'd just leave the alliance, but they'd never get attacked by the alliance because the alliance doesn't attack, but doesn't get attacked either. So until these systems are built, as exists at the vibrationary field of enlightenment, the enlightened ones, they work in this function. It's an alliance of systems altogether. Right? Many different type of enlightened beings, all working together on a vibrationary field, working on creation and their projects. Right? Well, they have to work together. They have to be allied because they all have their space, and sometimes some of them want to grow, so they get in conflict with other enlightened beings who defend that space. Right? So, it is the responsibility of spiritual leaders of their countries to be there for their country when their country is challenged in any way, threatened, attacked, anything like that. When their way of life, their culture of their country, their spirituality, their way of being is challenged. And the way that the Naga Babas and Agoris work, as they work with what is known as black magic, spells, right? So it's actually an application of city power, right? But, they can do little things, if you know what I mean, right? And then other things things happen in the real world in consequence of what they did. And this is a very important tool for a culture to develop, right? Because when we talk about defending yourself, there's physical defense, yes, but there's also, all types of defense, protecting your borders, obviously. You got to protect your borders, right? But there's also different types of defense, protecting your industry, your critical infrastructure, protecting everything, within your borders, protecting everything, right? So anyways, the Akaras, this is the subject of this video. The Akaras in India, right, are warrior monks, if you want to see it that way, of the Dharma, right, which are the warriors of God. And they develop, they're known for their spiritual powers that they develop that they can use to protect the Dharma if they're ever needed. So in that way, India is very strong, okay, because India has, obviously a wonderful big army, very advanced weapons, all that, but also has a wonderful tradition, so they're very established in tradition. They have a deep tradition, right? It's beautiful, beautiful tradition in India, right? And they also have the spiritual strength too that they develop through technology, spiritual technologies, and what this is actually and with physical application, and this is done through tantra. Okay, so tantra is basically technique. Okay, so that can be utilized, right, when necessary, and is utilized because these people are good people. These are divine people. People that got these abilities through being divine beings, right? They're taking divine path and getting close to God and being granted responsibility and city powers, all these things, right? So Tantra is a technique that can be utilized to have real world results in the real world. So what does it come down to is you develop yourself to a point where you can basically through processes will things into happening in the real world, and that's and then basically do whatever you want, right? So that can be utilized by the spiritual masters of a country, right, to defend a country if a country is ever under threat, for example, of annexation or something like that, right? Right, or if if it's getting invaded or if something like that, right? So then the spiritual masters of that country utilize their powers to defend the country, right? And depending on the power of the spiritual masters of that country, right? Compared to the spiritual powers of potentially the other country, right? And the god of the other country, right? So, I'll give an example, okay? When China invaded Tibet, okay, Tibetan masters, some of them, used their powers to try to protect Tibetan temples or people, maybe do things with the fog or stuff like that. Okay? There are stories of this recorded and shared. Okay? And the Tibetans were also had some very powerful magic, right? Some very powerful gods and defenses and stuff like that, which were basically on their side, right? But at the same time, there was also the equivalent spiritual force with the Chinese, right? So the Chinese also had their spiritual masters as well, right? That were also coming into play and their spiritual force as well. So on the side of Tibet, for example, you have, for example, the whole tradition of the Buddhas and all these different things, right? But on the side of China, the real big god of China is Chino, the Marachino, the great conqueror, who operates the Trajo, which moves systems from the 7th loka to the 8th loka of creation for the next turn of the age, when the sky will go red and the Shri will meet in the story at Kailash to fight the great battle against Marachino. Now, this is a part of the story, because Marachino is the leader of the gods. Okay? When you look at all the gods and their physical localizations around Kailash Mountain, Marachino is the Siva. He's the Shiva. He's the god of the planet. And his form is so you see there was a spiritual clash that took place with Tibet, with China. You know, all the gods of the system fall under the Chino. And the Chino is the god that brings that day which is known as that end day, when the sky goes red and the embodied trees meet at Kailash. So in this way you see that there was a lot going on in that clash between Tibet and China. But also, you must remember that Tibet had Tara. And Tara is the most powerful. Tara is the goddess. So Chino is also the most powerful and is the god. And you can see the face of Chino when you look down on Google Maps at Kailash Mountain. Right beside Kailash Mountain, you'll see a shape like that. And you'll even see a little mark for the eyes. And you'll see where on the Chino the staff of the great Shri was planted to bind him and tap into his Shakti. So, in the same way that that story is complex, when there is an interaction between, for example, nations anywhere that is souring, and one is threatened, if that country has an established spiritual tradition, it is the responsibility and duty of that spiritual tradition to use the power of their tradition to protect their land, their place. So this means, in a layman's terms, use your city powers and kick some butt. You know? And the fact is, there is no negative karma associated to a spiritual practitioner for using what they can to protect their homeland when their homeland is under threat. Anything goes. Like it goes for all the people of that country. But you know what happens is you have some people which are specific warriors that have spent their life developing those special powers, you know, so they're like an arm of the country, you know, that they're like an armed force of the country that defend the country, spiritual practitioners in countries like India that have those akaras, those developed parampara lineage traditions of spiritual practitioners that develop powers and all this that they can use if they have to ever to defend the country and the Dharma. So in other countries, they either have something like that established, or they have a few couple practitioners not too developed in their country, whatever, that they're not even aware of the need and the ability to use powers to protect your country. And then you have other countries that have other lineages that are established as well, right? And depending on how established, depending on how organized they are as well, right? So then you have lineages, for example, of different types, right? And then you have some countries, for example, that have traditions where you go and ask assistance to angels or to saints or to deities or to anyone or something like that for assistance in any case of need, right? And that is the method of basically using spirituality. And then you have others where you develop yourself into a spiritual being, right? And then you have what is known as masters as well. Masters. So some areas, so for example, in India, you have some spiritual masters, right? Some forces of nature, real forces of nature, I'm thinking, one force of nature that I'll acknowledge to right now is the leader of the Naga Baba, right? A force of nature, right? And he'll push the Shakti right into you, right? But you have also spiritual leaders of other traditions in other countries, for example, as well. So whether those traditions are associated to Christianity or to other traditions, you have spiritual practitioners that have developed to different degrees and levels, and also, different abilities, right? And remember that all abilities, all spiritual powers that come to spiritual practitioners come from, right, at their base from the Adi Shri, the dish dispenser, which dispenses spiritual powers on plates, right, to those who are granted spiritual powers, right? So in this way, it is a responsibility also for a country to encourage the development of spiritual lineages and the equivalent of akaras, in my opinion, in their country, right? Because these become, in a way, protectors of the way of life of that country, that if the country is ever challenged, will use spiritual powers to fight back. And spiritual powers, that's a wide, that's a whole new ball game. That's a big one. It's actually not new, but it's the unknown as well, right? What exactly can be done? What can't be done? And a lot of people dismiss these things, but the reality is that it's very real. It's very true, right? And that a country should develop their spiritual culture. And even if they have a multicultural culture, right, they should develop, a culture within their country that promotes spiritual development, knowing that beings can develop spiritually, right? And to have their equivalents in the way of Naga Babas and Agoris, but maybe for the modern age, a little bit their equivalents of Akaras as well, right? Armies of God, but for that country, right? So moving into the future, for cultures that want to last many, many, many thousands of years, countries that want to last many thousands of years, like India has, for example, and the culture there, look at their spiritual culture, and they have their warriors that protect their spiritual culture, and their life is their spiritual culture, because for them, spiritual development, spiritual moksha, and all these things are the most important, right? In other cultures of the world, other people have other priorities, right? But knowing about the truth of these things, countries, in my opinion, should have a responsibility to develop and promote spiritual practice in their country by the citizens of their country, and to organize that and to help organize people organize that, right? And also to promote practices of tantra, right? Practices of tantra, and practices that allow a practitioner to not only be a spiritually developed individual, but to be a spiritual weapon as well, a warrior of that culture and faith and dharma of that country, right? A protector of the country. So in that way, it's a responsibility for spiritual masters or gurus or sadgurus living within a country to owe allegiance to that country and to empower the people of that country and to bring blessings to them, right? Yes, but also to enter the battlefield with them if ever necessary to protect them, right? From a spiritual perspective. So when we're talking spiritual perspective, we're talking about the gods, the angels, the saints, all that stuff. So, right? So, and then you have, for example, the other country, for example, that might be threatening to annex them or something like that. And then, maybe they have some spiritually advanced people too, or maybe they don't in comparison, you know? So, as you know, there are, for example, maybe different ways of conflict, whether it be like tearing down temples, or whether it be doing financial conflicts or something like that, or more. um, you know um, there's ways to respond to all that stuff spiritually. So as you can, for example, have one country that would be more advanced, but or more powerful, for example. Let's say they developed more powerfully with like physical weapons or something like that. Maybe you would have one country that would have developed more powerfully with, maybe spiritual practitioners, spiritual weapons, in that way. So there's different types of weapons, and that, and basically abilities to inflict damage. And that's what war really is. It's inflicting damage until you win or until they surrender. So that's why so often when there's between countries or something like that, when there's a conflict, well, the spiritual practitioners on both sides also engage in conflict between to do that on behalf of their countries, right? And depending on how powerful they are, well, as there's potentially physical victories that are done, there can also be spiritual victories that are done, or spiritual dominance. So like you have dominance of the skies if you have better airplanes, for example, except when they fall, or whatever. You have better dominance of the skies when you have airplanes. In the same way, you have better dominance spiritually, right? And the spiritual realms is the realms to do different things, so to do very simply, stambhana is a very effective spiritual weapon that is extremely powerful in the modern age with modern technology that moves quickly in delicate circumstances. So stambhana is a very, very, very powerful tool. But there's so many other different tools and city power applications. They're countless, right? All the things that you can imagine in a sandbox environment for God, can be gifted to different spiritual practitioners to utilize, right? And then you also have the beings from the first stories that have their spiritual powers as well, right? So whether that be vampires, werewolves, all these different beings, including the beings from the enchanted waters and all these different things, all the different first stories, right? You have the ancient techniques of blood magic. You have different techniques, so many different abilities. So in that way, when there's a conflict between nations, or sometimes even organizations within nations, but let's say you have a conflict between nations for any kind of stupid reason, because conflicts are always stupid, but well, you have the responsibility of the spiritual practitioner of that nation to basically take the battlefield against the spiritual practitioners of the other nation to obtain dominance. So like you have air dominance, air superiority, to obtain spiritual superiority. And spiritual superiority is very important, actually. And this is one of the reasons that India lasted so long, spiritual superiority, because it's it can be applied to anything. It's really, as you have stambhana, you have so many different other types of powers that can be applied, including control over the elements. So you can do a lot of damage. Let's say let's say you have a country that you're in conflict with, and maybe there's different conflicts happening. It's at different levels of conflicts, physically or financially or any of these different things. But spiritually, you have the dominance spiritually, So let's say you win spiritually over that country, then you're able now to, impose on their on nature, for example, on their country, or on physical materiality and how things work, right? So you're able to basically do things like make sure all so many different things that you can basically apply, because you basically overwhelm the spiritual forces that were protecting that country. Right? The country exists. It has spiritual forces that protect it, right? Whether they're going directly to God, or whether they're going to another deities that protect them and also God, or whether they're going to saints or angels, or, the country has spiritual beings, divine beings that protect it, right? And you have the practitioners, right, which interact with those beings, which are those beings in incarnations as well within the country, the masters of the country, and all these different things. So when you have conflict between countries, you have basically a conflict for spiritual superiority over the battlefield. Okay, and we all hope that it'll resolve itself and all that, but in the meantime, what needs to be done, right? So you have superiority, which is established spiritually, right? So in that way, you have some countries probably that you don't want to mess with, like India. Everybody knows you don't want to mess with India, because first of all, they'll probably establish spiritual superiority in conflict with anyone that they get into very quickly. And unlike the Tibetan monks, which were very peaceful, tantric practitioners in the Akaras can be a little bit fierce, maybe, but there's fierce people in Tibet too. But once again, there was a storyline with Chino and China and the movement to the 8th Loka and all this, the taking of Kailash Mountain and all that stuff, with bringing it within China so that the god Chino would be within China. All these different things was long in the making. There was a long storyline with this. So this is why all this happened and was written into the story of Tibet. But in this way, the culture of Tibet left Tibet and spread within the world and flourished within the world, right? And met many people, including myself, when I was introduced, for example, to the first time and saw the first time the Kalachakra Mandala and recognized it, right? So as a visualization of the Kalachakra system, right? So, there's reasons for everything and how they take place. We have to have faith in God. That's the thing. We have to have faith in God, and all the people that work for him, all the deities and saints and angels, everyone in the organizational chart. Everybody's an organizational chart, and God's on top with the goddess, his love, and everybody's in the organizational chart, right? Under the emperor, the empress, the god, the goddess, right? Which rule over creation and visit sometimes as avatars, right? So in a conflict, okay, how does it work? So spiritually, okay, the spiritual practitioners, masters of the country, okay, battle out, okay, to establish spiritual domination, spiritual control over the spiritual field, okay? And then depending on the ability of the side that has established spiritual superiority, okay, then that spiritual superiority is applied to practical application. And this is one of the tools is called tantra. Okay, so technique, right? So that's basically how it works. Like in all ways of conflict, there's spiritual battlefield as well that takes place in these conflicts. As different countries have different gods and saints and beings that protect them and all these things. And when you start challenging the space, the territorial integrity, for example, of a country or something like that, then those guys get activated, and they come in, the gods of the land and all those things, all those different, and sometimes they're badass, right? And so sometimes, you have spiritual masters that are going to be high priests of gods, stuff like that. You have spiritual masters that are yogis. You have spiritual masters that are sannyasis. You have spiritual masters that are Buddhas, right? You have spiritual masters of different types, avatuts, avatars potentially, partial avatars potentially, siddhas, right? Different types of spiritual beings and spiritual development, which, okay, are all basically on the side of God, technically, right? But they're also on the side of their country, right? Because it's a duty as a spiritual practitioner, as a inhabitant of the land, to protect the land and its people, right? Because these are good people, these are divine people, right? So in that way, that's how it's done. So you have different beings of different abilities that that get involved in the conflict, right? So you can look at it a little bit like a civilian militia in that way that kind of comes in, and use their spiritual powers to bring peace and protect their country and their culture and their way of life, right? So in that way, that's how it's done. Okay. And spiritual stuff is really interesting because no, except people that can see these things, no one else sees it, right? Or understands it, or understands how it works, right? Or all these different things, and people understand to different levels, right? So it. So you have different situations, right? But that's why it was explained, because that's why it was explained to Arjuna, right, on the battlefield. That's why it was explained to him. You know, sometimes you just have to fight. Sometimes you just have to stand up, on your feet, right? And even if on the other side they're family, if they're coming for you, you can't give it. You can't surrender. You can't give up. You have to stand for your home. You know, that's it. And that's why a spiritual practitioner of a country is obligated, okay, to protect their country, to protect their home. Yes, to protect the whole planet, to protect all of creation. But also, as you come closer and closer to him, right, to his people, right, to his immediate neighbors and the people he's there to help as a spiritual practitioner, as well, and in this world, to spread the love and life of God, right? A spiritual practitioner gets involved in conflicts between countries, right? So there's actually a battlefield, a spiritual battlefield, and superiority is achieved. Okay, once superiority is achieved, there's different levels of application. Okay, so depending on the type of masters that exist within those countries, right? What type of masters are they? What techniques do they practice? So as you have, for example, warlocks, or you have, for example, Shri, or you have, for example, saints, or you have, for example, yogis, right? Or you have different beings that have all their spiritual powers and abilities. You have witches as well. Okay, those exist as well, and those are scary. I don't like witches. Okay, witches are scary, but you have witches as well. So you have all types of different beings that get involved on the spiritual level, right? And sometimes they're organized, and like in India, nakaras, in a way that where they have like they have a certain organization, right? But sometimes it's more dispersed, so depending on the what it usually comes down to for spiritual control, okay, usually comes to the top spiritual practitioner of that country, okay, or the top ones, the top few spiritual practitioners, right? So once you have a dominant spiritual practitioner that's defending, or that's going to go protect his country, right? Who's going to go to the battlefield and protect his country spiritually, just using his powers. He's not going to go anywhere. He's going to stay wherever he is. Spiritual practitioner is probably in his cave or in his little room, But when he embarks, on that, depending on what country has the most powerful spiritual practitioner, then that country gets spiritual superiority over the battlefield. And then depending on what type of practitioner it is, okay, then that practitioner can use their types of abilities with no resistance from the other side. The resistance has been defeated. Air superiority has already been achieved, right? So at that point, the other spiritual practitioners of that country can now use their offense also as well, unhindered, right? So because what happens is when you have a top spiritual practitioner in one country, that'll basically usually that individual usually go after, depending on, you have some countries that are really not developed spiritually, that don't know anything about these things, right? But you usually you go after all the other spiritual practitioners. You go bind them, limit them, and basically, that's the superiority part. Once that country has superiority spiritually, then all their spiritual practitioners are no longer challenged. It's like no longer having challenge in the sky with your planes. The other side has no more planes. Now you have superiority. So your whole side has superiority and can now use their powers and applications to affect, to basically defend the culture and the people of that country that have been attacked. Right? So this is called spiritual superiority on the battlefield. Now, depending on the types of practitioners, once spiritual superiority has been achieved, different practitioners practice in different ways and have different types of abilities. So all the different beings I explained to you, or even vampires, vampires with vampire powers and all these different things coming that can be used, or werewolves, with drums and different things. Lots of different powers that can be utilized by the beings that have discovered and these powers through their spiritual practice and awoken to the beings that they are as incarnations of, and remembered their past lifetimes and all these different things. So they have access to the tools that they have been granted and have access to at that point in their story. And with spiritual superiority on the battlefield, can now utilize those tools to wreak havoc, basically, right? So you have many different beings, right? So how does it work? As far as obtaining superiority, right? Well, when it comes to obtaining superiority, it's basically spiritual practitioners are going to be empowered by their deities or by God, right? Or they have themselves or they are themselves gods, right? With alliances with other gods that come into play often, right? So at that point, when the spiritual practitioners meet, it's me and my gods versus you and your gods, and where our countries are in conflict and there's a battle that's taking place, right? But when it's the same God, then you have whoever the God likes more. And then what happens, you have an interesting phenomenon where you have that other country gets abandoned by God when it's the same God. So that's a high level. That's horrible for that country, because they came up against a spiritual practitioner or something like that, that was closer to God than them, and it was the same God, and then their spiritual practitioners, their people got abandoned by God, right? And gave spiritual superiority to the other side. So that's hard, because getting abandoned by your own God is really hard. It hurts. It hurts. You know. So, but often it's different gods. Sometimes it's different gods that protect the land and all that. Okay, so but sometimes it's the same gods as well, and that's like infighting. That's really horrible. That's, and then God goes on one side versus the other, and then and then at that point it becomes difficult because the other side's been abandoned by God, so it's harder for them to get out of it. Because they're no longer blessed. So they're just going deeper and deeper into darkness. So there's a whole spiritual battlefield that takes place in conflicts between nations and conflicts between organizations too, or different spiritual groups sometimes too, but that's what I mean, between nations usually, or between areas. Sometimes it's small things between areas, different close areas, you know. And at that point, once spiritual superiority has been achieved, then that side can use all their powers to a very, very, very high effect, depending on the power of the spiritual practitioners on that side. So different practitioners utilize different techniques. So for example, you have practitioners of the Dharma, for example, that use techniques of the Dharma. That's very powerful. A lot of these things are well known now. They've been documented. City powers coming from the Adi Shri, right? All these different powers from the Dharma. You also have, for example, the gods of America, right? You have the gods of the Tej, the Aztec gods, right? And they operate out of the Tej, right? The Aztec Tej, which is a back door into the Dharma. So you have different levels of application. And when you have spiritual superiority, you can apply any level of application that you wish, in any way that you wish, in any manner and time and pattern that you see fit. So you can really apply really specific application through spiritual power, right? So different countries have their spiritual practitioners which protect the land. That's what it comes down to, right? We know God protects the land, and the spiritual practitioners, which are close to God, protect the people of the land and the land. That's what it comes down to. So now we all hope, of course, that all conflicts heal and all these different things. But in the meantime, it's important to understand that some countries are gifted different things. As some countries get wood or gold or diamonds or gems or minerals or access to the sea and the water, or an island to protect them, or different things, or more or less borders, or some of them get oils, some of them get different types of oils, some of them, everyone gets their strengths and their weaknesses, all the countries. So ideally we all work together as all countries one day, and everybody's strength becomes everyone's strengths, right? In a way, through sharing and being fair with each other and all these different things. But everybody gets their strengths, and as you have some countries that are more developed, more people, for example, less people, that's a strength, right? You have countries, for example, that have millions of people. You have countries that have billions of people. That's a strength. That's a huge strength, right? Lots of different types of strengths, right? But you also have strengths, for example, militarily. That's a strength, right? That's a very good strength. But you also have the strength spiritually, right? That's a very good strength too. So it's really good for everybody to work things out, and to really get together and talk things through. And I think one of the old principles, of spirituality, one of the old sentence, the ancient phrase, of spirituality, is when you get into someone's place and that place is already occupied, don't think to take it. And also, another thing of spirituality is when someone tells you back off, you always back off, right? And that's part of prudence, because you never know. Yeah, you never know. Right? You might just walk into a situation you don't want to walk into, that just wasn't worth it. You know, There's a lot of different lokas, levels of creation, parallel dimensions that are interconnecting, right? And the spiritual practitioner can operate at different levels at different lokas depending on their spiritual development, right? So, they can operate and that's why, it's important to understand that what you see and observe and see here, everything with your senses, is 1%, maybe not even 1% of what's really taking place in the story. That can be experienced and understood and operated in, right? So that means there's 99% more that exists in the spiritual realm. Okay, so with the 99% more in the spiritual realm, you can see that battlefield and superiority on that battlefield is very important. You know, so when everyone's in a no attack alliance and everybody's having fun, you have some people that are really good spiritually, some people that are really good with physical armies, some people that are really good with financial systems and do it for everybody, help everybody, and everybody helps each other as much as possible. And everybody, as much as everybody wants to be helped, some people more just want to do things their own way. They're part of the alliance, and everybody's a no attack alliance, but you know, everybody can grow in their own way in this no attack alliance, right? And no one gets challenged for their space ever. You say that your borders will never change. That's just how it is, except if you grow into places where no one is occupied, right? And that's rare. That's really rare, because the other way is the way of conflict. So if you go in the way of conflict, maybe you think you have a superiority in one of the methods of conflict, right? Or potentially different methods of conflict, but potentially you don't have superiority potentially in the spiritual realm. And when you think, for example, just about the Tej, you think about the powerful gods of America, the powerful gods of the continent, the Aztec gods, the Mayan gods, and all that interaction, with those pantheons, and you think about the gods of the land and all these different things. Hurricanes can be very expensive things. So can fires. So can drought, disease of your livestock, all these different things. There's so many things that can backfire in conflicts, right? Because of powers of gods, right? Powers of spirituality. So, in all conflicts, there's always that battlefield, that spiritual battlefield, where conflicts are waged. And the citizens of the countries that are the spiritual leaders, the spiritual masters, lead these conflicts spiritually. And basically, depending on which country has the most powerful spiritual master, spiritual superiority is achieved, right? If that master is able to achieve superiority, and then basically anything can be done on the other side, in all levels of their society, within the system with magical powers, right? And the other side has no more defenses, no more gods to defend them, no more God. God won't defend them. Let's say, that's why some of the countries are so powerful, right? Because they're protected by God, right? They've existed now a good amount of time and all that, and they say, we're under God, we believe in God, we're protected by God, and that's why there's a lot of countries that are powerful in that way, different names of God, okay, but God, right? Some countries also believe in deities and many gods and all these things too. But the countries that believe in God, that go to God directly, right, for help and assistance, they're very powerful often. They have one God. The countries with one God those cultures are often very powerful. That one God is very powerful and protects those countries, that takes them on in a way. But what happens is when you have two countries that come into conflict, that have the same one God, right, that go to the same one God, right? then it's a problem, because one God is the one God of both countries, both people, right? But then he has to choose, right, at that point with which spiritual practitioners he'll side, right, in that conflict spiritually, right? So that becomes a question of who's closest to God, right? And then basically that's what it comes down to for spiritual superiority on the battlefield in a conflict between nations: who's closer to God, right? Um, so at that point, that's how superiority is achieved. Once superiority is achieved, it's like having an open sky, no planes to fight back. Then you start getting hit at all levels of your society. You know, things very simply, just your planes being laid in your airports. All the time delays on everything, which add up and cost fuel and money and everything. Everything starts being delayed, and all your communication systems and all your transportation systems, all that energy starts being drained from all your systems, including your financial systems, your healthcare systems, everything starts going down. You start becoming isolated as systems. No systems want to interact with you as more. No systems trust you. No, there's all these different things that take place. All these different ways to wage conflict at the spiritual level. All these different techniques that can be applied. There's also more advanced techniques that can be applied if you have spiritual practitioners of a certain level on one side. Some of these techniques, for example, depending on the power of the spiritual practitioners and the gods, they will operate in different ways. So different gods have different powers that they can apply. But often you're talking about natural elements, things like sinkholes opening under you, getting hit by lightning, getting hit by a truck, getting hit by a plane, getting hit by something, getting hit by whatever, having an accident, something doesn't go well, right? There's things go really, really badly. You're having really, really bad days every day. And then you have other gods that can go into your nightmares, into your dreams, and can really hunt you in your dreams. So, for example, Hakavidim, the shepherd of the dream, which is a form of Shiva, right? Which is married to Kalividimi Kamakya, right? Right? The child goddess of the dream. Well, he creates dreams and he puts you in his dreams, in your nightmares. He creates a nightmare for you, and the goddess hunts you in the nightmare and destroys you in your dreams. So there's many, many different types of combat spiritually. There's also techniques of imitoraya shahidim shekpitrikitim sayam. So different techniques that can be used, many, many, many different techniques. That one speaks for itself. Spiritual masters of countries participate in conflicts between countries. Okay, they get involved. Okay, and what they try to seek to do is bring peace between the countries. Okay, because they seek an end to the conflict, because what they seek is the end to the existential threat to their country, to their culture, to their beliefs, to their dharma, to their people, that brought them into the conflict in the first place. Because spiritual masters don't really want to fight. They want to do meditation practice and have fun, enjoying the beautiful weather every day. So they get involved, and they try to fix the situation that got them involved, right? And as there are escalations on different battlefields and levels of warfare, there are also escalations on the spiritual level of warfare as well, right? So it's important to understand that these things do happen, right? So this is known, it's been known in many cultures since a long time. Different cultures would meet, and then you'd have shamans on one side or the other side invoking the gods and the powers and all that to help their troops and all these different things, right? So it's unfortunate. Conflict is always unfortunate, and we hope we can resolve it as adults, and hopefully as more modern beings than savages than we used to be, but There's a lot of history behind us. There were modern beings behind us too, and they couldn't get through it. So maybe we can. Maybe we'll do better. You know. Yeah, so spiritual application of spiritual practice, not just on the battlefield, but in everyday life, right? In everyday life, at all levels of all systems of the other country. So what you can do basically, for example, is you can attack their systems, all the different systems, including the systems of their minds. So some beings are very powerful, so sometimes you'll have a god, for example, that is involved spiritually, so you'll have potentially an avatar of God, you know and potentially that avatar will have developed superpowers or something like that, including the ability to get into people's minds, to get them to do things. So when you're talking to someone in their mind as God, and you've been talking to them for 2 weeks in their mind as God, and they've been listening to you, they're gonna change a little bit in their head as an individual, especially when you start telling them that you'd like them to do a favor for you and to do this thing for you. And different things can be done at many different levels, and that way all things can be interacted on. You know, some gods have many applications of city power that they can use, right? So you have different situations, right? So when you basically, it's one good way of seeing it as well is when you challenge a country, you challenge their spirituality, you challenge their culture, you challenge their self-identity, their self-determination, who they are as beings, as people, right? So you're coming in for their space, their resources. That's always what it's about, right? For what you want, their resources, their goods, all that stuff, their territory. But you have to understand that even if you think you're stronger at different levels, you may not be as strong as you think on many different levels. There's a lot of different levels, so no one should ever get engaged in the act of being of invading another country, or seeking to harm someone else, because there's many levels of many different things taking place, under God, you know. And you can't really do anything about these spiritual people because they're people that are connected to God. So when you do something to them, it's like it's known in Hindu tradition, if you harm a Brahmana, for example, you're going straight to hell, things are going to go really badly for you. So it's that same principle, that these are the people that are basically the ones that decide how things are going to end up, you know how things are going to finalize, because they're going to put these things into place, and it'll be relentless until people learn their lesson, right? Which is basically the guiding hand of God through these people that have spiritual powers, right? So that's why these people exist, these spiritual practitioners, to protect the cultures of the land, So in a way, I think it's important for countries to have that understanding, and that culture within their culture of their country, to have their spiritual practitioners develop and grow, and to have a thriving culture that practices tantra, right? Practices of tantra to protect their country, right? To protect their country and to be there to protect their traditions and culture, right? And there are many different types of tantra, many different types, you know. All the sisters have their own tantra, so there's many different types of tantra, and many different applications, right? So that is how it is, right? It's called. There's many different ways of looking at it, but it's important to understand that spiritual practitioners do have these little engagements with other spiritual practitioners sometimes, right? And at that point, whoever is the most powerful spiritual practitioner, so depending on how powerful they are, or how many there are, or how many powerful. You have one potentially that's worth 10,000 powerful ones, or you have maybe one that's worth 1 trillion of the most powerful ones, or something like that. You have scales of spiritual practitioners, right? And when they get involved, they can potentially even be gods walking the earth, avatars, full avatars. And then they get involved with all the powers of an avatar and all their alliances as gods, right? So you could even potentially have, a situation where the home of the Sri Satguru avatar of the royal lineage, his country, for example, would be challenged, for example, or threatened, or people planning on invading it or something like that, right, and taking control of it, right? Well, then you would have, for example, all the gods of the Vara Parampara, right, which is all the gods, because the Vara Parampara is the Adi Parampara connected to all the gods, right, which would then come into the battle, right? So it's not only the spiritual practitioners that do the battle, but also the gods that get involved in it too sometimes, right? And then sometimes you have, for example, the Siva, right? The Satguru, the Siva, who doesn't only lead the gods, right? But who also leads, for example, all the armies of demons and asuras and rakshasas and all these different beings, right? As we know that Siva associates with a lot of special different beings, right? So it's important to understand these things, to understand that countries have their own culture and spiritual development, which support them in times of conflict. So we say it basically, spiritual strength within us supports us in those difficult moments. And the same thing for spiritual practitioners, which support their countries, right, in difficult moments, when there's a conflict potentially where someone's coming to basically take their land or destroy their culture or something like that, right? So I wanted to talk a little bit about this in light of recent events all around the world, where a lot of people have stopped thinking with their heart and have started thinking with their with greed. With greed. I think that's a big way to see it. A lot of people are thinking with greed, and then you have a lot of people thinking with fear as well, right? So you should never be greedy. You should never want another man's land, you know. And you should always be appreciative to God for the land and life that you have. And as God doesn't bring conflict to your doorstep, or maybe conflict was brought to your doorstep, and hopefully you hope to God that it goes away, that God brings it away. Well, as God, you don't want God bringing conflict to your doorstep. I think that's pretty much the moral that I wanted to say. Thank you for listening to this video from the Sri Satguru Avatar, Adi Shri Om Tek Rasiva, Parasiva, God of the system, Emperor of the Golden Court and husband of the goddess. May there be peace and light on this world, and happiness and joy and prosperity. But if that's what you seek for yourself, don't cause to bring unhappiness to others.